Welcome to episode 5 of Arbiter of Worlds, the fastest growing Game Master channel on YouTube. According to my analytics, I'm up from 0 to 478 subscribers, which is an infinity% growth from just 6 weeks ago. So it's incredible. Thank you. Now, if you've been with us since episode 1 of our journey towards better game mastering, you'll remember that I said that a tabletop RPG game master has 4 chief functions: judge, adversary, world builder, and storyteller. And I said that the function of judge was your most important function. So today, we're going to think about how you should judge role-playing game sessions. And we are going to show that if you're judging a game properly, the so-called rules versus rulings distinction is a false distinction. But first, I need to give you a quick introduction to some concepts of jurisprudence. Let's start with the concept of a precedent. A precedent is a legal ruling on a particular issue that judges use to decide subsequent questions of law with similar issues. For instance, if a judge is asked to decide whether a semi-automatic pistol is a legitimate weapon of self-defense, a previous ruling that revolvers were legitimate weapons of self-defense would be precedent. And if the precedent is followed, it's called binding. If the precedent is ignored, the new case is said to be distinguished from the old by certain new facts. For instance, the court might distinguish pistols from revolvers by saying that their ammunition capacity is much greater. Now, the importance of precedent depends on whether your legal system is common or civil. The common law tradition originated in Old England. It's the history of legal rules created by judges when they decided disputes, right? So the judges began with the traditional customs of how matters had been handled, and then over time they built up a body of law based on those past precedents. And common law generally has little to no basis in anything written. There's maybe like a foundational constitution, some scattered medieval statutes, but like the main advantage of the common law is that it's rooted deeply in the traditions of the people, and it's really adaptable for areas of uncertainty. But the main disadvantage of the common law is that there's no written law that the citizens can consult to understand the laws of the land. It's all this sort of jurisprudence in the court cases. Now, in contrast, the civil law originated in the Roman Empire, and it was a collection, a code of statutes created by legislatures, and the judges interpreted the statutes, but their rulings were not creating law, right? The main advantage of a civil law system was that the citizens can just consult the statutes to understand the laws. They don't have to look at what the judges have said, and most of the statutes have been created by their democratically selected legislators nowadays. But the disadvantage of a civil law system is that you can't depend on different judges to interpret the law the same way each time there's a case. So if you're faced with a question, a purely common law judge is going to look up what prior judges said when they were confronted by similar questions. A purely civil law judge is going to look up what the most relevant statute says about the question and then interpret it on the spot as he thinks best. Since each system has weaknesses, like most legal systems today use a mix of both your civil and your common law, and you have legislators create this overall framework of statutes, and then the judges fill in the gaps using common law methods based on precedent. And under this system, you can look at the statutes to learn the baseline of the law, and then you can refer to past cases to understand how judges have previously ruled. And pretty much most of the developed world now runs under that kind of hybrid system. So what does this have to do with being a game master? Well, remember, the foundational role of an RPG game master is that of judge. And to extend that analogy, the game designer is analogous to the legislature. The game rules are the civil law, the citizens are the players, and the decisions of the judge about gray areas in the rules, those are the common law. And so the process of the judge ruling on gray areas creates precedent. And that means that today's rulings are tomorrow's rules. If you don't follow your own precedents, then your players cannot reliably understand the game world that they act within. And that deprives them of the ability to make informed choices, which is necessary for player agency. So let's illustrate this point, right? Let's illustrate what happens when precedent is ignored. Let's imagine you're running the classic 1980s edition of Basic Dungeons & Dragons. And your party is losing a fight, and all the player characters are badly wounded, and they need to undertake just a desperate retreat. They need to jump across a 15-foot chasm to safety. And Marcus, the party's fighter, he wins the initiative, he's up first. So, you pick up your copy of the basic rules, and you flip to the pages on movement, No, the fighters jumping across chasms is not covered in the basic rules, all right? And you're the dungeon master, though, and this is happening, so you have to make a ruling. You think about it, and you decide jumping across a 15-foot chasm is a test of like heroic agility. So you decide to resolve it with an ability check against dexterity. If Marcus rolls less than his dexterity on 1d20, he succeeds. If not, he'll fail and plummet to his death. That's your ruling. Marcus has a dexterity of 12. He rolls his d20. He gets a 9. And so that's less than his dex, and he succeeds. All right, and so next up in the initiative is Quintus, the magic user. And Quintus also needs to jump across the chasm. And so you, again, consult the rule book. Well, there's no rules for magic users jumping across chasms either. And you decide this is a test of Herculean strength, and you demand an ability check against strength. Quintus has a strength of 7. He fails the roll, and Quintus dies horribly when his body splats onto the chasm floor, 180 feet below. And it's like twitching, and blood is going everywhere. And Quintus's player is not happy. He's like, why did Marcus get to roll against dexterity, but I had to roll against strength for the exact same task? And, well, what can you say to this criticism? I mean, you can say, you're the GM, your word is law, and it's your right to rule however you feel best on situations not covered by the rules. You can say, there is no written rule stating which attribute is to be used in resolving the success of a jump. I mean, you can say that, but it's not going to persuade the player of poor dead Quintus that you're a good judge, because you're not being a good judge. You're being a terrible judge because you ignored your own precedent. So let's now imagine a couple weeks have passed and the party now, again, wants to jump across this damn chasm. I don't know. They're idiots. They don't think of rope. Whatever. It's a thought experiment, okay? Anyway, a character called Morn is the first to cross. And Morn has both 18 dexterity and 18 strength. So he's feeling really secure that whether you ask for a strength check or a dex check, he's got a really good chance of success. So you pick up your rule book, you check the rules, and you once again, you see in the rule book, there's no game mechanic specifying the chances of success. So you decide that each character has a 2 in 6 chance of falling in. Otherwise, they jump across successfully. And Morn's player is just, what? Like, he demands to know what the heck is going on. Now I've got a 33% chance of falling in and not the 10% chance if you'd stuck with either of your 2 past rulings. And so what does the GM do? You shrug and you're like, well, there's no rule that says it has to be an ability check. But there is a rule. Your prior ruling is the rule. Ignoring your own rulings is a terrible thing when you're running a game. A game run without precedent is a game that lacks fairness, it lacks common sense, and it lacks verisimilitude. And yet, it's so common when you're playing a rules-light game to experience this sort of arbitrary decision-making on the part of the game master out of an insistence that, well, there aren't really any rules, or rulings over rules. And this attitude derives from this failure to recognize that just like when a common law judge creates law when he decides a case, a game master creates new rules whenever he makes rulings, right? A game master creates new rules whenever he makes rulings. Because fairness to the players demands that the rules for any given situation be the same for each player in that situation. Now, it's common to call games like basic D&D, which heavily depend on these sort of GM judgment calls, we call them rules-light games. In contrast to rules-heavy games like Pathfinder, which provide, more exhaustive mechanics. But, now that we have a deeper understanding of common law and civil law, we can see that a game master's ruling is functionally a law, just like a game designer's rule is a law. Every rules-light game over time then becomes heavier with rules as you make decisions about how things work. Rules light and rules heavy are therefore only descriptive of the starting state of the game. Now granted, if you're just playing a one-off, right, then there is a really big difference. And rules light stuff is great for pickup games. But as you transition into a longer-term campaign, the rules light and rules heavy starts to become a false distinction. When you're running a long-term campaign, you need to remember that every time you issue a ruling, you've added to the common law of the game design. And so you need to write down your rulings. You need to apply them again to similar situations in the future, or at least be able to distinguish them from the prior rulings to explain why they aren't being applied. Now, the very best game masters do this so consistently that over time, their long-running campaigns develop an entire body of house rules covering many special situations that have arisen. And sometimes an entire new role-playing game will develop out of that. So my body of Dungeons & Dragons jurisprudence, which has developed over hundreds of sessions of basic D&D, ultimately became the Adventurer Conqueror King system. The skill-based RPG RuneQuest also began as a set of house rules for D&D. And you can actually find the transitional D&D to RuneQuest house rules. They were called the Perrin Conventions, named for RuneQuest lead designer Steve Perrin. You can still find them online. So the next time you look at that sleek little rules-light game you just bought and you think about what a breeze it's going to be to run a campaign with it, remember that it's not really going to be rules-light. You just haven't played it enough yet to make it rules-heavy. All right, so that's all for today. Remember, our way of having fun is the only way to have fun when playing RPGs. Other gamers might think they're having fun, but it's a false consciousness imposed upon them by the oppressive narratives of story gaming. And as the vanguard of the simulationist revolution, it falls to us to lead the luditariat to a better world, to an open world. I can't do it, all right? Hit the like and subscribe buttons. Thanks, guys.